The data grid is an extraordinarily powerful control. Let's create a small application to get a sense of what the data grid can do. To begin, we're going to need some data, and so we will create an employee class. That employee class will be marked public, and will implement iNotify property change. Let's start by giving the employee class two string properties, name and title. Since we'll be populating our employees with presidents, and their title will be president number 1 and number 2, let's have a Boolean property as to whether they were reelected. We'd also like to know their party affiliation, so we'll create a public enumeration for party, and let's place that outside of this class so that it is in the namespace but not confined to the employee class. And we'll call that enumeration party. We can then come back into the class and create a property affiliation, which is of type party. As we've done in the past, we'll create a helper method that will generate a number of employee objects, and this will stand in for getting these employee objects from a database or from a web service. What will be returned will be an observable collection. Let's add the necessary header for that. And then we will add each of these employees, adding in their name, their title, a Boolean for whether they were reelected, and their affiliation using the enumerated value. Now that we have data, let's turn to our view in main window and add a data grid. Our declaration of the data grid is extremely simple. We're just going to give it a name, and then we'll go over to the code behind, and in the constructor, we will set the item source using the employee class's static method getEmployees. Let's run the application. And there are a number of things to notice about this data grid. First of all of our properties from the employee object were picked up and became the titles. The Boolean was automatically turned into checkboxes. And interestingly, as we edit, the text becomes text boxes for editing. The checkboxes are immediately editable. And the affiliation, which is an enumeration, becomes a combo box so that you can pick from the enumeration. All of that is automatic. There are a few things we can do to make our data grid look a little nicer. For example, we can set the alternating row background color, and we'll set that to light blue. It needs to know how many rows to alternate, and so we're going to set the alternation count to 2, and that will be every other row. And when we run this, we'll see that every other row now has a light blue background. The biggest problem that we have is that it picked up the column headers from the property names, and that may not be what we want, especially this was reelected all run together. We may want to make any number of adjustments to these columns, and the way to do that is to write the columns by hand. The first thing that we'll do is come into our data grid, and we will set the auto generate columns property to false. That says that we will generate the columns ourselves. The first column that we're going to generate is going to be the name. And so we need to create a data grid columns, and within the data grid columns, we can add a data grid text column. Notice that we can set the header to anything we like, and we set the binding equal to binding to name. We can do the same thing for the title. If we run the application with just those two columns in place, we get the two columns, they display appropriately, and when we go into edit mode, they edit as text boxes as we would hope. But we can add additional columns. For example, we have the is reelected Boolean column. For that, we're going to use a data grid checkbox column and simply bind to the Boolean data. Now, when we run the application, the checkboxes are checked or not according to whether the value is true or false. Finally, we have the enumeration. In order for the enumeration to work, we're going to need to add to the resources of this window. What we want to add is an object data provider, and we want to give that a key. We also need to identify the object type. Notice that the object type uses the namespace core, so we need to add the core namespace. Once we've added the core namespace, we can say to our object provider that the key is myEnum. We can name it anything we like. The method name is getValues, and the object type is of type enum in the core namespace. The next thing we need to do is to set the method parameters. The method parameters, you can see the type is party defined in the local namespace. And so we must come back to our namespaces once again and define the local namespaces. And the way we do that is simply scroll down until we find this application and have it add the local namespace. Now the type here is party, and that's in the local namespace. Close off the object data provider, and that's the end of what we need to add to our Windows resources. We're now ready to come down to our columns. And what we want to add in the column is a data grid combo box column. We set the header as we do on any column. Now we need to set the selected item binding. And you'll remember that what we want to bind to is affiliation. Finally, we need to set the item source for the combo box itself, and that we're going to bind, and we can set the source equal to the static resource we just created, which is myEnum. You can see that we've created by hand each of the columns, and we've given them the appropriate types. All of this was done for us automatically when we allowed the data grid to select its own columns. But now we have control over the headers as well. Let's run the application, and when it comes up, we find that all of the columns are filled out appropriately, and if we edit a row, we get text boxes for the text, checkbox for the Boolean, and most important, we get a combo box for the enumerated type.